Hi everyone, my name is Lauren and my portion of the project is an overview of autism spectrum disorder and going over the DSM-5 criteria for this disorder. So to begin, autism spectrum disorder is also known as ASD, and it can be diagnosed as early as a year to 2 years old. And typically the behaviors and the behavioral features of autism spectrum disorder first become evident in early childhood. So some examples of those behavioral features include lack of interest in social interactions, developmental regression, loss of ADL, so like self-care, toileting, things of that nature, brushing your teeth, delayed language development, odd playing patterns, unusual communication patterns, and repetitive behaviors. Whenever autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed, it is known to be medically or genetically conditioned, and it can also be as a result of an environmental factor. Um, so whenever autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed, it is diagnosed in 3 stages. The first stage is requiring support. So during this stage, they have decreased interest in social interactions. They can be social, but typically it's unsuccessful, and they have a difficulty in switching activities. So going from one activity to another. Stage 2 is requiring substantial support. So during this stage, they have social impairment that's more noticeable even with the support given, and they have difficulty in changing focus. And then the final stage is requiring very substantial support. During this stage, they have limited initiation of social interactions and social communication. They respond very direct, and it's also extremely difficult for them to cope with change. Moving on, we're going to take a look at autism spectrum disorders criteria. So the first criteria is criteria A. During this part of diagnosing, they are looking at the deficits in social communication and interaction. So part 1 is stating that they have abnormal social approach and failure to have a back and forth conversation between themselves and another person. The second part of this criteria is poor verbal and nonverbal communication. So this would be eye contact, body language would be nonverbal, and then verbal communication would be successfully communicating from one person to the other. And then they don't understand facial expressions as well and those emotions. In the third part of criteria A is looking at the difficulty in adjusting behaviors, the difficulty making friends, and the difficulty to have imaginative play. Moving on to criteria B, this is looking at repetitive behaviors or restricted patterns. So part 1 is, repetitive use of objects or speech. So using the same toys every day to play, using the same forms of verbal language when communicating with another person. The second part of this is insisting on having that sameness or that same repetitive behavior. So going to watch the same movie or same TV show over and over again, and eating the same foods every day and not expanding their food plates. The third part of this is a fixated interest, so they have a strong attachment to whether it be Pokemon or LOL dolls, something that is they're fixated on that. That's their interest, and they invest a lot of their time in learning about that and becoming somebody who's very knowledgeable on that specific interest. And then the fourth part is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. So this is like having increased sensitivity to smells, taste, lighting, sounds, sometimes even like touching things. So those sensory things are either extremely magnified for somebody with autism spectrum disorder or extremely low for them. Moving on to part C, in this part we're looking at the symptoms being present in early development. So, whenever somebody is being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, whether it be at the age of 5 or the age of 8, they're going to be looking at the behaviors of the child from when they were a year to 2 years old in this early developmental period. And if they're not reaching the social demands and capacities, that's something that they look at in order to diagnose somebody with autism spectrum disorder. And part D of the criteria is stating that the individual should or must have or meet the criteria of having a significant impairment in social connections, whether it be being social at events or family gatherings, going into an occupation, having a job, holding a job, and then other important areas of their functioning. So impairments in their ADLs, toileting, taking care of themselves. The final criteria of autism spectrum disorder is criteria E. In criteria E, it's stating that autism spectrum disorder is often a co-occurring diagnosis of intellectual developmental disability, which is also something that is being explained in this project. So, the individual that's being diagnosed should have and should be below the expectations for general development in their lifetime. So you'll see a lot of individuals who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder are also being diagnosed with intellectual disabilities throughout their DSM-5 diagnosis experience. Thank you for tuning in, and next you'll have an experience with Kaya on our article.